Hello all and welcome to the first Creature Feature episode of One Spooked Professor. In the Creature Features, I'm going to do an analysis of a pop culture monster, focusing on where it comes from, what it can do, and the part it plays in culture, different depictions, and fun little factoids about the beast. I plan to do creature features on all sorts of monsters you've come across, including classic water monsters, werewolves, vampires, and the like. And some of these creature features will also have to be very broad because of that, considering how extensively some monsters have featured in cultures all around the world. Other creature features will focus on newer monsters on the scene. To start off, I'd like to talk about a monster that shambled its way into modern pop culture and spread like a virus through the popular imagination. We're talking about zombies, people. Protect your brains. A zombie is, at its most basic, generally understood as an animated corpse. Dipping a rotted toe into etymology, the first known recording of the term came in 1819, and the Oxford English Dictionary asserts the word's origin to be West African. The term, as we recognize it today, owes its origins to Haitian folklore, and the word most probably entered the popular Western mainstream through W.B. Seabrook's The Magic Island. The Magic Island focused on strange voodoo cults and their unliving slaves. Zombies evolved from that into the many beings that you would recognize, some of which hardly bear any resemblance at all to the sensationalized depictions of Haitian folklore. So let's dive into these dirty, rotten, undead corpses that often get shot wearing Nazi uniforms in video games and figure out what's the what about them. The concept of animated undead slaves or even cannibalistic corpses that hunt the living for sustenance predates Haitian folklore by centuries, and in some cases, millennia. The tropes that we often relate to zombies predate even feudalism. Ancient Mesopotamian texts mention the goddess Ishtar having the power to raise corpses that will eat the living. Don't forget the old Arabic ghouls that haunt burial grounds and cemeteries, feeding on human flesh. Some of these ghouls certainly resemble undead man-eaters. Others are shapeshifters, which veers away from the modern zombie and more to types of monsters you'd be familiar with, like the lycanthrope, or something that would actually be best described as malevolent spirits or demons. That's really the closest to the Arabic folklore depiction of these beings. Then there's the Mabinogion, which features a cauldron that raises silent, previously corpseified Irish warriors back from the dead. Then there's the armies of the undead that appear in Ragnarok in Norse mythology. The Greeks, well, more specifically the Cretans, even have a vampiric creature that had elements of the zombie called the Kathekano, which had a fondness for eating flesh too, particularly livers, and could spit up blood in the face of its prey, reminiscent of zombies that have an acid spit attack. All this and a lot more that I haven't mentioned point out that the concepts similar to the zombie are by no means only Haitian, but the invasion of the zombie into the United States undoubtedly comes from Haiti, at least as we recognize it. Talking about zombies means we need to codify what a zombie is. Any attempt to create a hard and fast definition would likely mean excluding works that obviously include zombies. The longer the zombie remains a fixture in culture, the more variations there will be, so I suggest listing many of the recurring tropes and acknowledging that zombies must by definition involve some of these features, but not necessarily all of them. Common features of the zombie and zombie-like beings could probably be summed up as follows. Zombies are often mindless, or at least have a very limited intelligence. In virtually all cases, some element of personhood is lost. Zombies consume people. Sometimes, though rarely in non-satirical works, the zombies just eat the brains. Most don't have so regulated a diet. Sometimes they'll completely devour someone, other times they'll just chow on them until that person rises up as a zombie or something worse. Zombies are undead, or at the very least so diseased or mentally compromised as to make any differentiation moot. Thus we often see reanimation as a part of the zombie creation process. Even simply diseased zombies that are actually still alive often undergo something akin to a mini-death before turning feral. Lobotomized, drugged, or mind-controlled people still very much behave like undead zombies, in the cases where the zombies aren't diseased or undead. Zombies can spread. They may do this by disease, or as there is some asshole that keeps summoning them, but rarely is a singular zombie the focus of an entire work. We often deal with zombies in groups, swarms, or even in epidemics, even though the first introduction of the zombie usually comes in the form of just one of them before more appear. This spreading often occurs through biting or some other form of contamination related to viruses, spores, magic, or even strange galactic radiation. Speaking of those methods of contamination, there is often a MacGuffin or applied phlebotomy that creates the zombie. This can be evil voodoo magic that often in no way resembles anything like real-life voodoo practices, an evil necromancer's vile magic, a virus, fungus, or a parasite that gets spread from person to person through contact with the infected, or even radiation from a space probe. Something makes the dead, or the almost dead, act up in ways they shouldn't. This phlebotomy might also be some sort of zombie drug or surgery. Linking back to the mindless nature of zombies, their motivations are rarely complex. They often have a singular purpose. This could be an evil magician's will, or simply the need to feed or spread. In achieving their purpose, zombies are savage, elemental, and uncompromising. They can't be negotiated with. They often must be killed in a specific way. The classic methods are fire or the destruction of the brain. Being undead makes them tougher, I suppose, though you wouldn't think so considering how fast human bodies decay in real life if there's heat and, well, moisture around. But we're just going to suspend our disbelief on that one. Lastly, there are often physical markers that make them different. At the very least, zombies often have vacant gazes or look noticeably pale and lifeless. Sometimes they're rotting or covered in strange fungal growths. Maybe they're just wearing Grateful Dead t-shirts. Something marks them as a zombie. I'm sure there are many more zombie tropes we could mention, but let's work with these. They still cast a wide net that covers a lot of what we often see in zombie fiction. This doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions. I've seen iZombie and YA romances involving sentient creatures labeled zombies, but I'm primarily going to be working with the pop culture ideas most often associated with the beasts, and even those young adult zombie stories include circumstances under which those intelligent zombies could end up becoming the classic monstrous zombie. The origin of the modern zombie clearly draws its roots from Haiti, as I've mentioned before. French colonization of the island, particularly the western section, is where our story begins. In order to grow and harvest sugarcane, the French imported a massive number of slaves from Western and Central Africa, some of which came from the Fon, or the Dahomey as they're commonly known, the Iwe, and the Yoruba peoples, many of whom brought over their traditions of West African voodoo with them. It is likely that Congo traditions were also imported in this fashion. Now, the progenitor practices of West African voodoo were suppressed by colonialist forces, but not annihilated. The same can be said of the version that would eventually take root in the Caribbean. Colonials tried to stamp out these traditions, but miraculously, they survived captivity, possibly as a form of resistance on the part of slaves determined not to lose the entirety of their identity. These traditions did change over time, however, and even took on aspects of Catholicism, becoming a unique entity that we recognize today as Haitian Vodou. The fact that these traditions survived at all is a miracle in and of itself, considering Code Noir, or the Black Code, which define the nature, circumstances, and conditions of slavery under French control, including the brutal punishments inflicted upon slaves and the destruction of non-Catholic spiritual traditions. Thus, Haitian Vodou, or voodoo, was practiced in secret. This would later end up adding to its mystique. A growing second-class citizen of non-white, non-slaves also existed on this island, including many of mixed descent among their ranks. All in all, non-whites far outnumbered white colonials on this island. Haiti became the second nation to achieve its independence from a European power in the Americas after the Haitian Revolution, and is the only state in America born from the liberation of slaves. Despite the influence of voodoo in this revolt, many of the leaders of said revolt distanced themselves from voodoo, putting forth the image that they were good Catholics and free men. The 1835 Haitian government made the practice of voodoo illegal, thus solidifying the already pre-existing nature of secret societies in the practice of voodoo. These secret societies play very much into the exotification and demonization of Haiti after the revolution. The very existence of a successful slave rebellion and republic that followed was a challenge to the colonial dominance and meta-narrative. Black autonomy came to mean savagery, cruelty, and superstition, at least as far as the narrative goes. Before the revolution, there had been rumors of human sacrifice and blood rituals. These were amped up and mixed with newer tales, including the actual Biziton affair, which was a trial held near Port-au-Prince. St. John, a diplomat that served as the British consul to Haiti from 1863 to 1875, wrote about this trial that led to the executions of 8 Haitians and linked the voodoo faith to human sacrifice and cannibalism in the public mind. Interesting to our study of the zombie is that St. John specifically mentions that priests claimed that a voodoo deity was capable of raising the dead. He doesn't use the word zombie, but no doubt this does play into the following Western view of the island and this faith. The zombie's initiation into the Western cultural canon undoubtedly owes the most to the aforementioned work, The Mystic Island. Haiti, at the time Seabrook visited it, was anything but magical. While not a generally well-known conflict in U.S. history, the U.S. occupation of Haiti was sort of a thing at the time. You can thank Woodrow Wilson for that one. War and occupation involve a great deal of cultural interaction and often exchange, making this point the most likely vector for the zombies' virulent spread to the wider American cultural consciousness. Seabrook wasn't the only person whose writings about Haiti and voodoo spearheaded the zombie horde, but he is the principal progenitor. This was only the beginning. The pulps embraced both the undead horror the zombie could bring and the racialized exoticism of voodoo priests. While H.P. Lovecraft is most famous for his cosmic horror stories and beings like Cthulhu, he was also one of the formative creators of the zombie genre. The most famous of his undead-themed works was Herbert West Reanimator. Herbert West Reanimator is noteworthy, particularly because it's one of the earliest depictions of non-magical, bestial versions of the creature. Zombies seeking vengeance, much like the revenants of folklore, also permeated fiction, especially in comic books, including the famous Tales from the Crypt. Meanwhile, the zombies also took to the cinema. Victor Halperin led the way with the film White Zombie, starring Bela Lugosi and based on Seabrook's Magic Island. The Ghostbreakers, King of the Zombies, I Walked with a Zombie, and The Plague of the Zombies all followed in its wake, among many others. The nature of zombies in American pop culture changed forever with George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, even though the word zombie never appears in the movie. Romero's zombies are recognizable as the classic zombies, from which most other pop culture forms of the beast now derive. The zombies in Night of the Living Dead weren't servants of some evil sorcerer or the product of race-based fears. In fact, many of the critics praise Night of the Living Dead as groundbreaking for having a black male protagonist who both keeps a level head and proved capable rather than lazy, cowardly, evil, or stupid. These zombies in this film were more akin to the type Lovecraft wrote about. These creatures were reanimated corpses intent on cannibalism. Romero's zombies staggered slowly but implacably toward their prey and lacked any problem-solving intelligence or the guidance of a human motivation. In this, they were an elemental force that isolated the human cast from the rest of the world that could very well be experiencing an apocalyptic event. The origin of these zombies was never completely confirmed, though the film indicates that it was probably radiation from a returning space probe. The Night of the Living Dead popularized the scientific, cannibalistic zombie. It also ushered in the splatter film genre and moved the horror of undead from exotic locations to familiar settings, both of which would influence other horror genres like the newly forming slasher genre. Just as important, Night of the Living Dead brought zombie fiction into a realm already inhabited by other forms of horror, that of social commentary. Not all of the following zombie films would bother with such a thing, but some would, including Romero's follow-up films like Dawn of the Dead. Romero wasn't the only formative voice of the zombie apocalypse. Another important work in that area was Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, even though it was nominally about vampires. Zombie films saw their ups and downs before the new millennium and their worldwide takeover, but the swarm won out eventually. This comeback was fueled in part by video games, which breathed new life into the genre and have remained a cornerstone of zombie media ever since. The House of the Dead and Biohazard led the charge. The latter of the two, called Resident Evil in the West, saw much more success than House of the Dead. Resident Evil also popularized the disease-based zombie in the form of the T-virus. 28 Days Later, which in many ways is a Day of the Triffids with zombies kind of tale, the comedy Shaun of the Dead, and the Dawn of the Dead remake followed up on these video game successes, bringing the zombies back into the film game. The zombie horde really hasn't stopped since, despite their halting gait and some pit stops to eat along the way, and the beast just keeps on taking new forms. Now that I've bumbled my way through the history of the genre, I'd like to take a look at some of the variations the zombie has taken. We've already talked about the basic Romero zombie, that shambling monster that seeks out flesh in order to consume it. They're not very quick, but they tend to arrive in hordes. They're obviously undead. These are the classic zombies that most people think of. It was 28 Days Later and a remake of one of Romero's own movies, Dawn of the Dead, that introduced a variation on this type of zombie, the Runner. They pretty much function like the Romero zombies, except they're far more aggressive. They'll sometimes let out screams of rage or anger or predatory hunting cries, whatever you want to think of them as they pursue their targets. They still aim to consume living flesh. They will stop to attack a slower target if that is more easily available. They are interested in the consumption more than just the killing. They are also often limited in their intelligence. They're just much faster. They'll often also kamikaze their way through objects, smashing through doors, smashing through windows, displaying an absolute lack of care for their own well-being to get to their prey. Still undead, still zombies. But it was this variation of the zombie that relates to another version I want to point out, the infected from 28 Days Later. These creatures are not actually undead at all, nor are they interested in consuming the corpses of the living. They are in fact people sick that are infected with a disease somewhat akin to rabies, mixed with the parasites that can modify the behavior of mice so that they commit suicide by cat in order for the parasite to reproduce inside a cat's intestines. This is called the rage virus. These creatures don't need to be shot in the head, they just need to be killed in some way that would kill a normal person and stop them from moving about. They are also not interested in consuming the dead. They quickly leave someone who is dead and no longer infectable. They are merely vectors for the disease that spreads. They are similarly unintelligent like many zombies, but they are just as aggressive and just as uncaring about damage to their physical person as the runners from the Dawn of the Dead remake. Both of these incarnations of the fast-moving zombie show a shift in what people find terrifying. People who thought, oh, I could get away from the old Romero zombie, now have an individual pursuer that is much more dangerous. The runners and the infected can still fulfill the old Romero zombie's implacable elemental force to trap them in a location, as demonstrated by the whole mall being surrounded by zombies, but they individually also offer more of a threat and demonstrate why characters aren't going to try and outrun them, solving some of the logical issues that could come up during zombie fiction. Yet they still remain just as implacable and just as unstoppable as the Romero zombie. You'll tire, they won't. The rise of the runner does not actually signal the end of the Romero zombie. There are plenty examples of the old shamblers running about, well, not really running, they wouldn't be shamblers if they were running, shambling about in modern fiction and modern culture. One of the most prominent examples recently is The Walking Dead. I mean, they're called walkers for a reason. And if you haven't noticed from the body count, they are certainly dangerous. Another place you'll see a lot of shamblers or Romero-type zombies, or at least those with some relation to the Romero zombie, comes in video games. The video game series Dead Rising gives a great example of these creatures as mooks that you have to deal with by the dozen, often with ingeniously crafted devices that allow you to chop them down no problem. But their numbers are still a threat. The video game series Resident Evil has featured the Shambler zombies prominently, and in the Resident Evil 2 remake, manages to bring back their horror in full, especially when your character can shoot them in the head 3 or 4 times and still go, oh crap, they're moving, how do I stop these things? More often than not, though, the Shamblers are where you see the cliched zombie tropes applied, including the bullet to the head, usually, note I say usually, killing them. Another new zombie type to appear in fiction is the Fungal Zombie, probably inspired by the fungus that infects ants and modifies their behavior, the famous zombie ant. The Last of Us, while primarily focusing on the human experience of the apocalypse, is a great example of the Fungal Zombie. They have variations of these creatures depending on how far the fungus has progressed, including my favorite, the clicker, with those awful noises that I can still hear in dark rooms. The Fungal Zombie draws upon many of the traits associated with the infected, or sometimes even the Shambler zombies of other fiction, but combines it with a bit more of added realism, because we, as consumers of the internet in all of its forms, are very much aware that fungal zombie creatures exist in real life, at least in the form of the zombie ant. So in this way, the creators can help you with that suspension of disbelief. They can also use the fungal zombie to create some rather visually horrific creatures. I mean, body horror all the way. Again, check out Last of Us if you want to see a great example of this in action. The fungal zombies are not simply confined to the traditional roles of zombies in the post-apocalypse or in the now, or even in the past. There are actually examples of the fungal zombie in video games in particular, in science fiction settings. Halo is a great example of this with the Flood. They are a fungal species that can spread across life forms very much in a zombie-like virulent fashion, and they're controlled not by some evil voodoo master, but by an overwhelming parasitic intelligence known as the Grave Mind. The fungal zombies are not the only form of sci-fi zombie available. If you can have zombies in the present, you can bet that sci-fi stories can create their own. Star Wars has multiple examples of them, the rat ghoul being one of the ones most prominent to me. The Necromorphs from Dead Space are perhaps one of the most innovative zombie-like creations. They are indeed zombies in space, but they're far more dangerous. They're faster, they can take many different forms, they very much combine elements of the zombie fiction with the Ridley Scott xenomorph to create something rather horrible, and certainly something that's going to fuel your paranoia. Those different forms of necromorphs, as they are called in the Dead Space game, also bring me up to a concept that you see often in zombies featured in video games, and there are different versions of them. This is great, particularly for that medium, so that the player doesn't merely get one gameplay experience of, oh look, more shambling hordes, what am I going to do? Oh, the same thing I've done every other time. These can be bosses, these can be creatures that make your experience a little bit trickier. They will require shifts in tactics. They can even allow players to take control of these strange infected or undead, as is the case in Left 4 Dead, what it's like to be on the other end of the zombie apocalypse and to screw with other players. You'll see these special infected or special zombies much less in film than you do in video games because of the needs of video games versus the needs of film, but they are another important zombie innovation that has since stuck with the genre. The fantasy genre, too, has embraced the zombie as much as the rest of pop culture. If you play Warhammer, you can expect to see zombies, or zombie-like creatures, as a feature of armies like the Vampire Counts. The Draugr in Skyrim are definitely more like pop culture zombies than they are like the Draugr of mythology, who in many cases could actually shift their forms and the like. Necromancers in virtually any setting seem to be able to create zombies, much like a voodoo priest. The Warcraft Forsaken and the Dark Souls Undead also give us an interesting hybrid of both a playable sentient person and a monstrous being with undead-like qualities, as well as a narrative to combine the two. Seeing as we're talking about more sentient creatures with zombie-like traits, I want to take one look at Warm Bodies and iZombie. iZombie because, in this case, the zombies are basically people who have to feed on brains or become the Romero-like zombie. When the iZombies do eat brains, they tend to experience the memories of the people whose brains they're eating and even inherit aspects of their personality. This allows the main character to be a zombie crime solver and provides room and means for a lot of the comedy and, in some cases, horror of the TV show itself. Most notably, the iZombie creatures are sentient humans for the most part, with some of the zombie-like traits associated with them, and the fear of becoming a true zombie if they don't feed on brains. Warm Bodies could best be described as a zombie romance story, and when I first heard those two words put together, I went, what the hell are you thinking? But that's what we're dealing with here. In this case, the zombies are beings of almost pure apathy. They are people afflicted by a disease that makes them lose their personhood, their memories, even their names, and the only way they can get some of that back is by eating the brains of normal humans. Not unlike some of the elements that we've seen in the iZombie television show. The main character is similarly a zombie who eats people's brains, and eats the brains of the lead female character's boyfriend, starts to develop some feelings for her, or at the very least inheriting something from that boyfriend and protecting her. Long story short, the zombies are eventually cured by the power of love. Love being that human quality, positive emotions, separating the apathetic, even monstrously negative zombies like the Bonies, the zombies who have lost all of their human elements, from actual people. The central theme of this work being what makes people people. Again, you see that trope of loss of personhood being essential to the zombie. Another intelligent creature with clear personhood most of the time, assuming you're not dealing with the feral variety, that has zombie-like qualities is the Fallout Ghoul. The Fallout Ghouls are people who have been exposed to radiation to such an extent that they have become corpse-like beings who are basically immortal. Well, ageless at the very least. They can be killed just like anybody else. As some people pointed out, particularly by a shot to the head. The ghouls are often victims of fantastic racism in the Fallout series, and in some cases have been embittered by it. They also, either through overexposure to radiation or through a degenerating mind, can become ferals, which for all intents and purposes are basically runner zombies. Ghouls that have their personhood, however, can be just as valuable companion as anyone else in the game. Their inclusion in Fallout is no doubt because of the zombies' importance to American pop culture, and virtually everything involved in American pop culture in some way finds a home in Fallout. One last zombie that I want to talk about, because it is so similar to the fungal zombies and disease-ridden zombies we've mentioned before, is the parasitic zombie. This is a person whose body has been in some way influenced or taken over by a parasitic being. Resident Evil is again a great example of this type of zombie. The Las Plagas are beings where you have a person who is being controlled, manipulated, changed, or in some way used by a parasitic creature. As I mentioned before with the infected and the parasites that can modify the behavior of mice, these creatures actually have some basis in reality, allowing us to suspend our disbelief. And the Resident Evil variety allow us to have zombies that can, to some degree, use limited intelligence and even tools. They're still zombies of some form, but they're not the classic zombie, and the parasites often give them mutation powers or some other visible body horror-esque scare. Regardless of what movie, video game, or book we're working with, you will generally see certain themes associated with the zombie. One of those is disease or infection. This is often the case in stories where the zombies are created by viruses, parasites, radiation, or funguses, but even dark magic and negative emotions. It's something that is virulent and spreads. Apathy can spread, hatred can spread, disease can spread. It's something infectious. This can play on man versus nature-esque fears of disease and the like, but it can also feed on man versus society and man versus man fears in the form of mob mentality. People who often lose some sense of their personhood or their inhibitions, or get infected by dangerous ideas and some ideological conflicts, all are representative of that virulent nature of zombieism. So, thematically, its virulence can be associated with a number of different ideas, and commonly appears. Violence is also something commonly associated with the zombie. We remove the normal human inhibitions against hurting others. Whether it's the magical zombie that will kill you because its master demands so, even if it's formerly a loved one of yours, or the rabid, voracious infected from 28 days later, those human blocks against attacking each other are gone. There is no guilt, there is no fear, there is only the violence. Often associated with the more magical versions of zombies, or in the case of Resident Evil, the parasites as well, are mystic cults and secret societies. This is clearly a holdover from the exotified Haitian-style zombie, where the cults are secretly playing at Machiavellian-style games, dealing with hidden magic and seeking powers, and having access to forbidden knowledge. So this naturally feeds into stories of paranoia and the other. The loss of individuality is almost universal among zombie stories. even in ones where the zombies are sympathetic, like iZombie and Warm Bodies. This is also important on ideologically driven stories, ones that are driven by allegories of totalitarianism, consumerism, communism, whatever ism you want to deal with. The loss of individuality is central to that loss of personhood that is a part of what makes any zombie a zombie. Perhaps tied to all of these as well is the notion of death and the fear of death, or the fear of undeath in its unnatural form. Last of all, I'd like to talk about a genre you're probably all familiar with if you've come to this podcast. That is the post-apocalypse. Why have zombies in particular become so associated with post-apocalyptic events? And part of that may be because they align with elements of so many other parts of the apocalyptic genre. Zombies could play a role in environmental apocalypses, it could play a role in biological apocalypses, it can play a role in magical apocalypses, and even does so in several different mythologies. In all of these cases, the zombie apocalypse focuses on how society breaks down, on how fragile the bonds of society really are, and the need of the individual to look out for themselves. You can see why this often is juxtaposed with the loss of individuality of becoming the zombie. The post-apocalyptic event also can force the main characters to face this horde on their own. Not only do the humans have to deal with the fear and dread that comes from being separated by others of their kind and from lacking the support of the system, it also lets us focus on the individual experience rather than a systemic reaction to the undead. In fact, I would say the only zombie story that I've seen handle the systemic side of the zombie apocalypse very well is World War Z. Not the movie, the book. The movie tries to go more personal with it and throws out a lot of the stuff that the book created. There's virtually no relationship between the two. And while I am not at all being paid to advertise the World War Z book, I definitely advise you read it if you love zombies. Well, that's a very brief tour of the world of the zombie. I myself came into contact with these creatures primarily through video games. I played Resident Evil as a child when I was probably way too young to do so, and I loved every minute of it. And from there, I expanded into other forms of zombie madness. So I wanted to devote the first creature feature to these bad boys. So board up your windows, the zombies are still loose, which means I'm getting out of here. Toodles, folks.